Carthage, 149 BCE. Roman prisoners walked through golden streets they thought were paradise, until the screams from below revealed a truth that would haunt the Republic forever. What they discovered beneath the marble wasn't just slavery, it was a machine of human misery so vast it powered an empire. And when Rome finally understood what built Carthage's wealth, they knew only fire could cleanse what gold had corrupted. Carthage, North Africa, October 12th, 149 BCE. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning olive groves across the Mediterranean, as Consul Manius Manilius pressed his legions against the outer walls of Carthage. From the hills overlooking the great harbor, Roman war machines hurled stone and fire into a city that had once commanded the seas. But on this day, fortune would reveal her cruelest face to three men who thought they understood the price of empire. Centurion Marcus Brutus Calvus, veteran of 23 campaigns, led his century through the rubble of what had been Carthage's southern gate. At 38, his scarred hands had guided Roman steel through Gaul, Hispania, and now Africa. Behind him marched Quintus Fabius Maximus, a young Optio of 19, whose family name carried the weight of generations who had bled for Rome. The third man, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, bore the most famous name in the Republic, grandson of the victor of Zama, now serving as a military tribune at 25. Desperate to prove that greatness lived in his bloodline. The morning assault had begun with the ritual precision that made Roman arms feared from Britain to Egypt. Calvus watched his men advance in tight formation, their shields locked in the testudo that had broken barbarian charges and Gallic fury. The Carthaginian defenders, starved by 2 years of siege, seemed to crumble before Roman discipline. Victory appeared certain, until the earth beneath their feet opened like the mouth of hell itself. Hidden tunnels, carved from the limestone bedrock over decades of preparation, erupted with Carthaginian warriors who had waited in darkness for this moment. Bronze blades flashed in the morning sun as Rome's finest found themselves surrounded, cut off from their legions by enemies who knew every stone of their ancient city. Calvus heard Maximus cry out as a spear took him in the shoulder. Scipio's sword sang as he carved through 3 attackers, but more kept coming from passages that seemed to lead into the very heart of the earth. The sound of battle changed, from the measured clash of disciplined warfare to the desperate ring of men fighting for their lives in narrow spaces where tactics meant nothing, and only raw skill could save them. Calvus saw his century scattered, some dead, others retreating toward the Roman lines. In that moment, watching his young Optio bleeding and the grandson of Scipio Africanus, surrounded by bronze-armed shadows, the centurion made the decision that would seal their fate. "Fall back to the gates," he roared. But the gates were gone, collapsed by some Carthaginian device that turned Roman engineering against itself. Dust filled the air, mixing with smoke from burning siege engines. In the chaos, Calvus grabbed the wounded Maximus while Scipio fought a running battle toward what they thought was safety. They ran through streets that seemed carved from dreams of avarice. Even under siege, even starving, Carthage displayed wealth that made Rome seem like a collection of mud huts. Golden statues lined avenues paved with marble that gleamed white as bone. Ivory doors opened onto courtyards where fountains still played, their waters carrying the scent of exotic spices from lands Rome had never seen. Silk tapestries, worth more than a legionnaire's lifetime pay, hung from windows where Carthaginian eyes watched with the patient hunger of those who knew their moment had come. But it was the silence that unnerved them most. A city under siege should echo with screams, with the sounds of desperation and dying. Instead, Carthage hummed with an industry that seemed almost supernatural. From somewhere beneath their feet came rhythmic sounds, hammering, the creak of machinery, and something else that made Calvus's veteran instincts scream warnings his mind couldn't yet understand. The 3 Romans found themselves driven deeper into the city by Carthaginian soldiers, who seemed more interested in hurting than killing them. Calvus, supporting the increasingly pale Maximus, began to realize they were not fleeing. They were being guided. Each turn they took, each alley they chose, led them further from the walls, deeper into the golden heart of their enemy's power. Scipio, his sword still bloody, was the first to voice what they all felt. "Centurion," he said, his voice carrying the authority his name demanded, "this is not random. They want us alive. But why? If you're captivated by the untold stories of ancient empires, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic historical chronicles. Comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching this tale of Roman prisoners and Carthaginian secrets unfold. At random. They want us alive. But why? The answer came as they rounded a corner into the Forum Carthaginiensis, where the greatest marketplace of the ancient world spread before them like a fever dream of wealth. Even now, with Roman catapults hurling death at the outer districts, merchants haggled over goods that represented the tribute of nations. Calvus had seen the markets of Alexandria, had walked through the bazaars of Damascus, but nothing had prepared him for this display of accumulated prosperity. Ivory from the depths of Africa stood carved into figures so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Persian carpets, each thread worth a denarius, hung in cascading displays of crimson and gold. Phoenician glass caught the October sun and scattered rainbows across marble floors, inlaid with precious stones that spelled out the genealogies of Carthaginian nobility, in languages Rome had never learned to read. But it was the slaves that made Maximus, even through his pain, grip Calvus's arm in shock. They moved through the Forum with the efficiency of human machinery, their bodies bearing the marks of systematic modification. Some had been blinded to enhance their other senses for specific crafts. Others showed the deliberate scarring that marked their specialization. Silk weavers with fingers elongated through careful breaking and resetting. Pearl divers with enlarged lung capacity achieved through methods that left their ribs visibly deformed. "By all the gods," Scipio whispered, his patrician composure cracking as he watched a line of children, none older than 12, carrying amphoras filled with what appeared to be molten gold. Their arms showed the burn scars of those who had learned their trade through pain, and their eyes held the hollow emptiness of souls that had forgotten they were human. Their Carthaginian captors, for that's what they clearly were despite the absence of chains, wore the purple-edged togas that marked them as citizens of the merchant class. The leader, a man whose soft hands and carefully oiled beard spoke of a life spent counting profits rather than wielding weapons, gestured for them to observe more closely. "Romans," he said in accented Latin, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education that rivaled anything Rome's finest schools could produce. "You see before you the engine that has powered our prosperity for 6 centuries. What you call slavery, we call efficiency. What you consider cruelty, we know as necessity." Calvus, his soldier's instincts screaming danger even as his mind struggled to process what he witnessed, kept one hand ready for his gladius while supporting Maximus with the other. The young Optio's breathing had grown shallow, and blood continued to seep through the makeshift bandage they'd torn from a dead Carthaginian's cloak. "Why show us this?" Scipio demanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations of Roman leadership. "If you mean to kill us, have done with it. If you seek ransom, name your price. But this," he gestured at the systematic degradation surrounding them, "this serves no purpose but to satisfy some twisted pride." The Carthaginian merchant, for merchant he clearly was despite his role in their capture, smiled with the patient indulgence of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. "Pride? No, young Scipio. Recognition of your family name precedes you even here. We show you this because your republic believes it understands the price of empire. You think strength comes from discipline, from the loyalty of citizens, from the honor of those who serve." As if summoned by his words, the rhythmic sounds from below grew louder. The hammering, the grinding, the mechanical precision of vast undertakings echoed up through drains and sewers and passages that seemed to honeycomb the entire city. With each sound, Calvus felt his understanding of warfare, of siege, of victory itself, begin to crumble. "But Rome has never learned the first lesson of true power," the merchant continued, his voice barely audible above the industrial symphony rising from the depths. "Strength built on willing hearts fails when those hearts grow weary. Empires founded on honor collapse when honor proves too expensive. Only pain endures, Roman. Only suffering, properly organized and systematically applied, creates wealth that spans generations." Maximus stirred in Calvus's arms, his young face pale but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had marked him for promotion despite his age. "The sounds," he whispered, loud enough for only his companions to hear. "Centurion, those aren't the sounds of a city under siege. That's industry. Massive industry. And it's coming from below." The realization hit all 3 Romans simultaneously. Carthage wasn't just a city built on slavery. It was a city built over slavery. The golden streets, the marble forums, the displays of wealth that made Rome seem poor by comparison. All of it was merely the visible surface of something vast and terrible that operated in the darkness beneath their feet. The merchant's smile widened as he watched comprehension dawn on Roman faces trained to read battlefields. but unprepared for the architecture of systematic human exploitation. "Come," he said, gesturing toward a colonnade lined with statues that depicted Carthaginian victories spanning 4 centuries. "Your education has barely begun. The surface wealth you see is merely what we allow the world to witness. The true foundation of Carthaginian power lies in understanding that human suffering, properly channeled, becomes the most renewable resource in existence." They walked deeper into the city's heart, past temples where priests in golden robes chanted prayers to gods whose names predated Rome by 1,000 years. The October sun cast long shadows through marble columns that soared higher than anything in the Forum Romanum, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs that told stories of tribute flowing from every corner of the known world. But Calvus, veteran of campaigns where survival depended on reading the landscape, noticed details that made his tactical mind recoil. The streets weren't just paved with marble. They were built over a network of iron grates that allowed the sounds from below to filter upward. Steam rose from these openings, carrying scents that had nothing to do with cooking or normal urban life. The air itself tasted of metal and sweat and something else that reminded him of the aftermath of particularly brutal sieges. Maximus, growing weaker but maintaining the stubborn courage that had earned him his rank despite his youth, forced himself to walk without assistance. "Centurion," he said quietly, "the spacing of those grates. It's not random. They're placed for maximum ventilation across a grid that extends as far as I can see. Whatever they're operating down there, it needs air circulation on a scale that suggests thousands." Scipio finished, his voice hollow with realization. "Thousands of people working in spaces that require engineered airflow to prevent suffocation." Their guide overheard and nodded approvingly. The young tribune shows promise. "Yes, thousands. But thousands is still thinking too small. Carthage has perfected what Rome has never understood, the mathematics of misery. We have calculated precisely how much suffering a human body can endure while remaining productive. We have determined the optimal caloric intake required to maintain strength without encouraging rebellion. We have mapped the psychological breaking points that transform a warrior into a willing tool." As they moved through districts where the wealth grew more ostentatious with each street, the evidence of the vast undertaking beneath their feet became impossible to ignore. Bronze pipes, wider than a man's arm, carried water in and waste out through systems that dwarfed Roman engineering. The sound of hammering wasn't random. It followed rhythms that spoke of coordinated labor on an industrial scale that defied imagination. They passed a plaza where a fountain carved from a single piece of black marble depicted scenes of triumph that made Roman victories seem modest. But Calvus noticed that the fountain's base was built around what appeared to be ventilation shafts, disguised as decorative elements. The water itself was artificially cooled, and the engineering required to maintain such a system spoke of resources and planning that extended far beyond simple civic pride. 600 years, the merchant continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone of a priest describing sacred mysteries. 6 centuries of careful experimentation, of refining techniques passed down from father to son, of learning precisely how to break the human spirit without destroying the human body. Rome conquers through force and hopes loyalty will follow. We conquered through understanding that loyalty is merely one emotion among many, and pain is more reliable than love. The industrial sounds grew louder as they approached what appeared to be the city's administrative center. Here, Carthaginian officials in silk robes consulted tablets that recorded not tribute or taxation, but numbers that made Calvus's blood chill. Population counts, production quotas, mortality rates calculated with the precision Romans reserved for military logistics. But it was a chance glimpse through an open doorway that gave them their first direct view of what lay beneath Carthage's golden surface. Through marble stairs that descended into torchlit darkness, they saw figures in chains moving with the mechanical precision of human machinery. The distance was too great to make out details, but the organization, the sheer scale of systematic labor, created an impression of controlled desperation that made even hardened soldiers struggle to maintain their composure. Maximus stumbled, and this time, it wasn't from his wound. "They're not just using slaves," he whispered. "They're manufacturing them. This entire city is built over a machine designed to break human beings and rebuild them as tools." The merchant's approval was obvious. "Now you begin to understand why Rome will fall and Carthage will endure." The merchant led them through gates that bore inscriptions in scripts older than Latin, older than Greek, reaching back to the dawn of Phoenician expansion, when Carthaginian ships first carried the secrets of systematic exploitation across the Mediterranean. These weren't the crude barriers Romans threw up around enemy positions. They were architectural achievements that spoke of centuries of refinement, of a society that had perfected the art of concealment. Your republic believes in the nobility of struggle, their guide continued as they descended marble steps that seemed to spiral into the earth itself. You celebrate the farmer who becomes a soldier, the soldier who becomes a consul. But nobility is inefficient. Honor wastes resources. We learned long ago that true power comes not from inspiring the best in human nature, but from exploiting the worst with scientific precision. The temperature dropped as they moved underground, and the sounds that had haunted them from above became a symphony of organized misery. Calvus counted his steps automatically, a habit that had saved his life in Germanic forests and Gallic strongholds. 50 steps down, then 70, then 100. Then, they were descending into spaces that had been carved from the living rock of Africa itself, chambers that extended far beyond what any surface building could require. Maximus, his young face drawn with pain and growing horror, leaned against the wall for support. The wound in his shoulder had stopped bleeding, but infection was beginning to set in. Still, his Optios training kept his mind sharp. "Centurion," he whispered, "the air currents. They're managed. This isn't a natural cave system. It's been designed for circulation on a massive scale." Scipio, bearing the name that had brought Carthage to its knees at Zama 53 years earlier, moved with the rigid control of a man confronting a truth that challenged everything his bloodline represented. "My grandfather spoke of Carthaginian wealth," he said quietly, "but never of this. How could Roman intelligence have missed an operation of this magnitude?" The merchant overheard and laughed, a sound devoid of warmth that echoed off stone walls worn smooth by generations of human traffic. "Because your spies, like your generals, see only what happens in daylight. Rome wages war with trumpets and standards and speeches about glory. We wage war with ledgers and calculations and the understanding that a broken spirit serves longer than a dead hero." They reached a landing where torches revealed their first clear view of the infrastructure that supported Carthage's surface prosperity. Bronze pipes, each wide enough for a man to crawl through, carried water and waste through systems that spoke of engineering sophistication that made Roman aqueducts seem primitive. But more disturbing were the human modifications these systems required: openings sized for specific body types, maintenance passages designed for workers whose growth had been deliberately stunted, access points that spoke of a labor force bred and shaped for their function. The sound of organized industry grew overwhelming as they continued downward. Hammering, yes, but also the rhythmic scraping of tools against stone, the creak of machinery operated by human power, and underneath it all, a sound that made even Calvus's veteran nerves recoil, the whispered counting of voices maintaining work rhythms through shared recitation. "Listen carefully," the merchant said as they paused before massive doors carved with symbols that predated written history. "What you hear is not chaos. It is not desperation. It is the sound of human potential realized through absolute control. Every strike of hammer, every turn of wheel, every breath drawn in these chambers serves a purpose calculated to extract maximum value from the fundamental resource that powers all empires: suffering." Through gaps in the doors came glimpses of what lay beyond. Vast chambers lit by oil flames that cast dancing shadows across scenes that defied comprehension. Figures moved with mechanical precision through tasks that seemed to involve the processing of materials on an industrial scale. But these weren't the random brutalities of ordinary slavery. This was systematic, scientific, refined through generations of experimentation into something that transformed human beings into components of a vast machine. Maximus, despite his weakening condition, pressed closer to the gaps in the doors. What he saw there drained the last color from his face. "They're children," he whispered. "Some of them can't be more than 8 years old. And they're—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Specialized," the merchant completed with obvious pride. "Bred for specific functions, trained from birth, modified as necessary to achieve optimal productivity. We have children whose fingers have been carefully broken and reset to achieve the dexterity required for our finest metalwork. Others whose vision has been enhanced through controlled exposure to specific minerals. Some whose lung capacity has been expanded to allow them to work in environments that would kill ordinary humans." Scipio's hand moved instinctively to his sword, but the merchant merely smiled. "Violence, young Scipio? Against whom? The children who know no other life? The overseers who were once children themselves? The system that has fed and clothed and housed millions across 6 centuries. You Romans think in terms of battles won and lost. We think in terms of resources managed and optimized. The doors opened with the precision of mechanisms maintained by generations of skilled hands, revealing chambers that stretched beyond the reach of torchlight into depths that seemed to extend beneath the entire city. What they saw there would haunt Roman nightmares for generations yet unborn. The first level contained workshops where human beings had been transformed into living tools through methods that combined surgery, psychology, and an understanding of pain that bordered on the scientific. Children whose growth had been deliberately stunted operated machinery designed for their specific proportions. Their fingers, broken and reset multiple times, possessed dexterity that allowed them to work with metals and precious stones with a precision that surpassed anything Roman craftsmen could achieve. But it was the organization that struck Calvus most forcefully. This wasn't the random cruelty of barbarian raids or the desperate efficiency of siege warfare. Every aspect of the operation showed signs of systematic refinement spanning centuries. Workstations were positioned to maximize productivity while minimizing the energy required to transport materials. Lighting was calculated to provide optimal visibility without wasting oil. Even the positions in which the workers stood had been designed to reduce fatigue, while preventing the development of muscle groups that might enable resistance. Maximus, struggling to remain upright as infection spread through his system, pointed to a section where workers operated machinery that seemed to process raw materials on a scale that defied imagination. "Centurion," he whispered, "look at their coordination. They're not just individual slaves, they're components of a single machine. Each person's movement triggers the next person's task. It's like watching a military formation, but perfected through generations of refinement." Scipio finished, his voice hollow with a realization that challenged everything his family name represented. This isn't just slavery. It's the systematization of human suffering into an industrial process. Their guide gestured for them to move deeper into the complex, past chambers where the processing of materials gave way to something that made even hardened soldiers struggle to maintain their composure. Here, newly captured slaves underwent the initial stages of transformation from human beings into specialized tools. The process involved techniques that combined physical modification with psychological breaking in ways that Roman military discipline had never imagined possible. "We have learned," the merchant explained with the pride of a master craftsman describing his finest work, "that the human spirit, properly understood, follows patterns as predictable as the movement of the tides. Fear, hope, despair, acceptance. Each emotion can be induced and manipulated to achieve specific behavioral outcomes. What your republic calls torture, we consider education." In chambers carved from the living rock, they witnessed scenes that redefined their understanding of what human beings could endure while remaining functional. Workers whose bodies had been modified for specific tasks operated with the mechanical precision of water clocks or siege engines. Some had lost limbs that were replaced with bronze prosthetics designed not for comfort, but for optimal task performance. Others showed evidence of surgical modifications that enhanced their value for particular specializations, while ensuring they could never survive outside the controlled environment of the underground complex. But it was in the deepest chambers that they encountered the revelation that shattered what remained of their composure. Among the workers laboring in the furthest reaches of the complex, Calvus recognized faces that bore the unmistakable characteristics of Roman breeding. Not just any Romans, these were men who had once served in the legions, soldiers whose disappearance in previous campaigns had been attributed to death in battle, rather than capture and systematic processing. One figure in particular caught Scipio's attention. Despite modifications that had transformed him into something barely recognizable as the man he had once been, the facial structure was unmistakable. "Marcus Cato," Scipio whispered, naming a centurion who had vanished during skirmishes 3 years earlier. He was reported killed near Utica. His family received his pension. His name was carved on the memorial stones in Rome. The man who had once been Marcus Cato continued his assigned task with the mechanical precision that marked all the workers in the deep chambers. His eyes, when he briefly looked up, showed no recognition, no awareness of his former identity. Whatever techniques the Carthaginians employed to transform captured soldiers into compliant tools had succeeded so completely that the personality of the Roman centurion had been entirely erased, replaced by something that served only the function for which it had been designed. "Now you understand," the merchant said, his voice carrying satisfaction that bordered on religious ecstasy. "Why Carthage will survive this siege, and why Rome will ultimately fall. You build your empire on the loyalty of citizens who retain the capacity for independent thought. We build ours on the absolute reliability of tools that have been perfected through centuries of refinement. Your soldiers may die for Rome, but our workers live forever in service to Carthage. The implications hit all three Romans simultaneously. This wasn't just about current prisoners or captured enemies. This was about a system that had been processing Roman soldiers for decades, transforming the Republic's finest into components of the very machine that powered their enemies' prosperity. The recognition of Marcus Cato, a man whose funeral rites had been performed in Rome, whose widow had remarried believing herself free, whose children bore the honor of a father who died gloriously in service to the Republic, shattered something fundamental in the minds of the three prisoners. They stood in chambers that redefined the meaning of defeat, watching their own people reduced to components in a machine that had operated in secrecy for generations. Calvus, his tactical mind struggling to process the implications, began counting the recognizable faces among the workers. "Jupiter's bones," he whispered. "That's Gaius Marcellus from the 4th Legion. And there, Titus Flavius reported dead at Hadrumetum 2 summers ago. How many of our glorious dead are actually down here, serving as tools for Carthaginian prosperity?" The merchant, observing their shock with the clinical interest of a natural philosopher studying specimen reactions, gestured toward record tablets carved into the chamber walls. "We maintain careful documentation," he said with obvious pride. "Every Roman soldier processed through our facilities is cataloged by name, rank, family connections, and specialized applications. Your Republic's military records are remarkably helpful in this regard. You Romans are so thorough in documenting your personnel." Maximus, fighting waves of fever that made his vision blur, forced himself to focus on the tablets. Despite his weakening condition, his Optio's training in logistics allowed him to read the organizational system. What he saw there made him grip Calvus's arm with desperate strength. "Centurion," he said, his voice barely audible, "the numbers. They're not just processing captured soldiers. They're processing entire units. Look at the dates. This has been happening systematically for decades." The tablets revealed a scope of operation that made their current predicament seem insignificant compared to the broader implications for Rome itself. Entire cohorts reported as lost in battle had actually been captured and processed. The organizational charts showed how Roman military knowledge had been extracted and applied to improve Carthaginian operations. Tactical innovations developed by Roman engineers were being used to expand the underground complex. Siege techniques pioneered by Roman generals were being adapted to create more efficient methods of psychological control. Scipio, struggling to maintain the dignity that his family name demanded even in circumstances that challenged the foundations of Roman honor, studied the deeper implications of what they were witnessing. "They're not just using our soldiers as slave labor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of realization. "They're using Roman military expertise to perfect their system. Every tactical manual, every engineering technique, every organizational method we've developed over centuries, it's all being turned against us." The merchant nodded approvingly. "Intelligence, young Scipio, is just another resource to be harvested and applied. Your soldiers arrive with minds trained in Roman methods. We extract that knowledge and incorporate it into our operations. The result is a system that grows stronger with every Roman victory, because every victory brings us prisoners, whose expertise we can absorb and improve upon." As they moved deeper into the complex, past chambers where the processing of captured Romans had become an industrial operation, they encountered evidence of modifications that went beyond anything they had yet witnessed. Here Roman soldiers were being systematically altered, not just physically but mentally, their personalities rewritten to serve Carthaginian purposes while retaining the technical knowledge that made them valuable. The sight of a former Roman engineer directing the construction of machinery designed to process more prisoners efficiently represented a level of systematic perversion that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. The man worked with obvious expertise, applying engineering principles learned in Roman schools to create more efficient methods of breaking Roman spirits. "Lucius Antonius," Calvus said, recognizing the engineer despite modifications that had left him barely human. He designed the siege works at Canusium. His innovations were supposed to be classified military secrets, and now they serve Carthaginian efficiency, the merchant replied. "We have learned that human knowledge, properly extracted and applied, becomes more valuable than the human who originally possessed it. Your engineer now serves purposes far greater than any he could have achieved in Roman service." The psychological impact of watching their own people transformed into willing tools of their enemy's power created a form of horror that went beyond physical torture. These weren't broken slaves maintaining some spark of human identity, despite their circumstances. These were Romans who had been so completely reprogrammed that they served Carthaginian interests with genuine dedication, their original loyalties not just destroyed, but inverted. Maximus, his fever rising and his wound showing signs of serious infection, leaned against a wall carved with inscriptions that recorded the successful processing of Roman prisoners dating back nearly a century. "They're going to do this to us," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of fever-induced clarity. "This entire tour, this education they're providing, it's preparation. They're showing us what we'll become." The merchant's smile confirmed what they had all begun to suspect. Their capture hadn't been random, and their current treatment wasn't mere sadism. They were being prepared for integration into a system that had perfected the transformation of Roman excellence into Carthaginian advantage. The merchant led them through corridors that served as galleries displaying the evolution of Carthaginian methodology across generations. Here, carved reliefs depicted the refinement of techniques from crude early experiments to the sophisticated psychological and physical modifications they had witnessed. Each relief was accompanied by inscriptions detailing success rates, optimal procedures, and innovations that had improved the transformation of captured enemies into loyal servants. "Your republic," the merchant explained as they walked past displays that chronicled centuries of systematic brutality, "believes that human nature is fixed, that a Roman soldier will always remain Roman in his heart regardless of circumstances. This fundamental misunderstanding is why Rome will fall. We know that human identity is merely a collection of memories, habits, and associations that can be systematically altered through proper application of controlled experience." Calvus, his military mind automatically cataloging defensive positions even in their hopeless situation, noticed that the corridors were designed to prevent escape attempts. Every turn, every doorway, every architectural detail served dual purposes: aesthetic display and practical containment. The Carthaginians had learned from centuries of processing prisoners that hope was the enemy of successful transformation, and every element of their facility was designed to eliminate hope through overwhelming evidence of systematic inevitability. They reached a chamber that served as both observatory and preparation area, where Carthaginian specialists planned the processing of new acquisitions. Here, detailed anatomical charts showed how different body types could be modified for specific functions. Psychological profiles outlined the techniques required to break various personality types. Medical procedures were documented with the precision that Romans applied to military engineering. Maximus, his condition deteriorating rapidly, but his intellect still sharp, studied charts that mapped the systematic destruction of Roman identity. "They know us," he whispered, his voice thick with fever and growing weakness. "Not just Romans in general. They know us specifically. Look at these preparations." The charts showed detailed profiles of all three prisoners, compiled from intelligence gathered over years of observation. Calvus's military experience was catalogued with suggestions for extracting tactical knowledge, while preventing him from applying that knowledge against Carthaginian interests. Scipio's family connections were analyzed for their propaganda value, with plans for using his transformation to demoralize other members of the Roman elite. Maximus's youth and intelligence were noted as factors that would make his reprogramming particularly effective. "Every Roman who enters our facility," the merchant explained with obvious satisfaction, "is studied extensively before processing begins. We know your strengths, your weaknesses, your psychological vulnerabilities, your family connections, your military specializations. This knowledge allows us to customize the transformation process for optimal results." The preparation chamber contained devices that seemed designed for precise application of controlled suffering, not the random brutality of ordinary torture, but systematic procedures calibrated to achieve specific psychological effects. Some apparatus was clearly medical, designed to perform the physical modifications they had witnessed. Others seemed intended for the more subtle work of personality reconstruction. Scipio, fighting to maintain composure as he confronted detailed plans for his own transformation, studied documents that outlined how his family name would be exploited. "You plan to use us for propaganda," he said, his voice carrying the controlled fury that marked members of his bloodline. "Roman nobles voluntarily serving Carthaginian interests would undermine confidence in the Republic itself." "Voluntarily," the merchant emphasized. "That is the crucial element. Broken slaves serve adequately, but willing converts serve brilliantly. Our techniques ensure that you will genuinely believe in the superiority of Carthaginian methods. You will serve not because you must, but because you will be incapable of conceiving any alternative. In the final preparation chamber, they encountered the beginning stages of their own processing. Carthaginian specialists had already prepared the specific procedures that would be applied to each prisoner. Calvus would be subjected to techniques designed to extract his military knowledge while rebuilding his personality around loyalty to Carthaginian strategic interests. Scipio would undergo procedures that preserved his intelligence and family breeding while redirecting his ambitions toward Carthaginian goals. Maximus, because of his youth and potential, would receive the most complete reprogramming, his identity entirely reconstructed around service to the system that had captured him. The process, the merchant explained as they observed preparations that would soon be applied to their own persons, begins with the systematic removal of all connections to previous identity. Memories are not destroyed but recontextualized, so that experiences that once inspired loyalty to Rome become sources of shame and rejection. Physical modifications ensure that return to previous life becomes impossible, while psychological conditioning makes such return unthinkable. Calvus, veteran of campaigns where he had seen brave men broken by circumstances beyond their control, recognized the signs of systematic psychological warfare, refined to levels that surpassed anything Romans had encountered. "How long?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of a soldier who had assessed his tactical situation and found no hope of victory. "The initial phase requires approximately 60 days, the merchant replied with the clinical precision of a craftsman discussing his methods. "Complete integration takes 6 months to 2 years, depending on the individual's initial resistance and the complexity of the reconstruction required. But you will find that resistance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the process demonstrates its inevitable success." Through openings in the preparation chamber, they could see other prisoners in various stages of transformation, Romans whose processing had begun days or weeks earlier. The progression was clearly visible, from desperate resistance through growing confusion to eventual acceptance, and finally to eager participation in their own continued modification. Maximus, his fever creating moments of startling clarity between periods of delirium, pointed to prisoners who showed signs of recent capture. "Some of those men," he whispered, "they're from our own assault this morning. The soldiers who disappeared when the tunnels opened. They're already here." The moment of ultimate truth arrived as Carthaginian attendants entered the preparation chamber carrying instruments that gleamed with the cold precision of medical tools refined through generations of systematic application. These weren't crude implements of torture, but sophisticated devices designed to achieve specific modifications with minimal damage to valuable human resources. Maximus, his fever reaching critical levels that made his thoughts blur between clarity and delirium, was selected first. His youth and the infection spreading through his system made him the most vulnerable to immediate processing. As attendants began restraining him with leather straps designed to prevent movement while maintaining circulation, his fevered mind achieved a moment of terrible lucidity. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying surprising strength for someone in his condition. "You've made an error in your calculations, a fundamental miscalculation that will destroy everything you've built here." The merchant paused, his confidence replaced by curiosity. In 6 centuries of systematic processing, resistance usually took predictable forms: rage, despair, bargaining, or broken acceptance. Intellectual challenge was rare enough to merit attention. "Explain," the merchant said, gesturing for the attendants to pause their preparations. Maximus, his optios training in logistics giving structure to thoughts that threatened to dissolve in fever, forced himself to speak with the precision that had earned him promotion despite his age. "Your system assumes that Roman military knowledge can be extracted and applied without understanding the philosophical foundations that make it effective. But Roman tactics work because they're based on principles you've systematically eliminated from your own society." Calvus and Scipio exchanged glances, recognizing something in the young Optio's voice that transcended his physical condition. This wasn't delirium. This was the sharp intelligence that had made him valuable to the legion, speaking with the clarity that sometimes accompanied mortal fever. "Roman military success," Maximus continued, his words carrying increasing strength, "isn't based on superior equipment or overwhelming numbers. It's based on the voluntary cooperation of citizens who retain individual judgment. Every tactical innovation you've stolen from Roman minds was created by men who could think independently, who could adapt to unexpected circumstances, who could sacrifice personal advantage for collective benefit. The merchant's interest sharpened, but Maximus pressed on before he could respond. Your processed Romans can replicate Roman techniques, but they can't innovate. They can't adapt. They can't make the independent decisions that create new tactics or respond to unexpected circumstances. You've created perfect copies of Roman engineering and Roman organization, but you've eliminated the Roman spirit that makes those techniques effective. In the growing silence, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the vast industrial operation beneath Carthage, Maximus delivered his final assessment with the stark clarity of approaching death. This siege will succeed, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but carrying absolute conviction. Not because Roman arms are superior, but because Roman minds retain the capacity for creative response that your system systematically destroys. Every innovation your processed Romans create strengthens methods that were designed by free minds thinking freely. When those free minds encounter your innovations, they'll develop countermeasures that your processed Romans can't conceive. The mathematical elegance of his argument struck home with devastating effect. The merchant's confidence wavered as he confronted the possibility that their entire system contained a fundamental flaw that made it ultimately self-defeating. But it was Scipio who delivered the killing blow to Carthaginian certainty. Moreover, he said, his voice carrying the authority that his bloodline had earned through generations of strategic excellence, your intelligence gathering has revealed your methods to Roman observation. Every soldier you've processed, every technique you've demonstrated, every facility you've constructed, all of it has been observed and reported by reconnaissance we've conducted over months of siege preparation. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of distant explosions that seemed to be growing closer to their underground location. The Roman assault on Carthage's outer defenses, which had seemed like a distant concern when they were captured that morning, suddenly took on immediate relevance. Calvus, his veteran instincts recognizing the sound of systematic siege work, began counting the intervals between explosions. Sappers, he said with growing confidence. Roman engineering crews working in coordinated teams. They're not just attacking the walls, they're targeting the foundation systems that support this entire complex. The realization hit all of them simultaneously. The morning assault that had resulted in their capture hadn't been a failed attack. It had been a reconnaissance in force designed to map the underground systems that supported Carthaginian operations. Their capture, their guided tour through the processing facilities, their detailed observation of Carthaginian methods, all of it had been anticipated and planned for. The merchant's composure finally cracked as he realized that his prisoners had been gathering intelligence even as he demonstrated the sophistication of Carthaginian, systematic brutality. Every detail they had observed, every technique they had witnessed, every structural weakness they had noted, was information that Roman intelligence had planned to acquire. Impossible, he whispered, but the growing sound of approaching destruction made his denial meaningless. Above them, the golden city of Carthage was beginning to burn, and beneath them, the vast machine that had powered 6 centuries of systematic exploitation was about to face the one force it had never been designed to resist, the creative adaptation of minds that retained the freedom to think beyond the parameters of any system, no matter how sophisticated. The explosions grew closer, and with them came the sound that every veteran of Roman sieges knew intimately, the methodical destruction of structural supports by engineers who understood exactly where to strike. The vast chambers that had housed 6 centuries of systematic brutality began to shudder as Roman sappers collapsed the foundation systems that supported Carthage's underground empire. Maximus, his fever breaking in the face of approaching liberation, managed a weak smile as dust began falling from ceiling stones carved by generations of slave labor. The reconnaissance teams, he whispered to Calvus. They weren't just mapping defensive positions. They were identifying the load-bearing structures that support this entire complex. The merchant, his composure completely shattered, screamed orders in Punic to attendants who had already abandoned their posts to flee toward emergency exits. The systematic efficiency that had marked every aspect of Carthaginian operations dissolved into panic as the reality of Roman engineering precision became undeniable. Calvus, his veteran instincts taking control as the sounds of approaching destruction created opportunities for action, broke free from restraints that had been designed to hold broken prisoners rather than determined soldiers. The Carthaginians had made the fundamental error of assuming that displaying their system's sophistication would demoralize rather than inform their captives. As sections of the ceiling began collapsing, revealing chambers above that housed even more extensive operations, the three Romans fought their way through corridors filled with fleeing Carthaginians and liberated prisoners. The systematic organization that had made the complex so efficient became a liability as predetermined evacuation routes created bottlenecks that trapped fleeing personnel. Scipio, drawing on tactical knowledge inherited through bloodlines that had conquered half the Mediterranean, led them toward structural weaknesses he had observed during their descent. The same analytical skills that made Roman engineering superior to all rivals allowed him to identify escape routes that Carthaginian designers had never anticipated. They emerged into the golden streets of Carthage as the sun set on October 12, 149 BCE, carrying with them knowledge that would reshape Roman understanding of the price of empire. Behind them, the underground complex that had powered Carthaginian prosperity for 6 centuries collapsed into rubble, burying secrets that had sustained a civilization built on the systematic exploitation of human suffering. The destruction of Carthage's hidden foundation proved more decisive than any military victory. When Roman forces finally breached the city's defenses 3 years later, they found a population that had lost the infrastructure necessary to sustain their traditional way of life. The machine that had transformed human misery into golden wealth lay buried beneath tons of stone and metal, its secrets partially preserved only in the memories of 3 Roman soldiers who had witnessed its operation. But the true legacy of their discovery would not be the immediate triumph it provided. As the Roman Republic evolved into an empire that spanned 3 continents, it would gradually adopt methods that bore disturbing resemblances to what they had witnessed beneath Carthage. The systematic exploitation of conquered populations, the transformation of human beings into economic resources, the organization of suffering into industrial efficiency, all of these would find expression in Roman institutions that claimed moral superiority over Carthaginian brutality. Maximus, who survived his wounds to become one of Rome's most innovative military engineers, would spend his remaining years designing defensive systems intended to prevent the kind of systematic exploitation they had witnessed. His innovations would be adopted throughout the empire, but they would also be adapted by later generations to serve purposes he never intended. Scipio would return to Rome carrying detailed intelligence about Carthaginian methods, information that would influence Roman policy for generations. But the knowledge he brought would prove to be a double-edged gift, providing techniques that strengthened the Republic while simultaneously corrupting the moral foundations that had made Roman strength possible. Calvus, the veteran centurion who had seen empires rise and fall across 23 campaigns, understood most clearly what their experience portended. In his final years, he would write memoirs that warned against the seductive efficiency of systematic brutality, knowing even as he wrote that future generations would read his warnings as instructions rather than cautions. The 3 prisoners who had been shocked by Carthage's golden city and horrified by the slaves beneath it lived to see their own republic transform into something that bore uncomfortable resemblances to what they had escaped. Rome's victory over Carthage had eliminated a rival, but it had also provided an education in methods that would ultimately contribute to the empire's own moral decay. History would record the destruction of Carthage as a triumph of Roman virtue over foreign corruption, but those who witnessed the truth beneath the golden streets knew better. They had seen the future of their own civilization reflected in the systematic brutality that efficient exploitation could achieve, and they understood that victory over Carthage had taught Rome lessons that would eventually destroy the republic they had died to defend. In the end, the machine that powered Carthaginian prosperity for 6 centuries would find new expression in Roman institutions that claimed moral superiority while practicing refined versions of the same systematic dehumanization. The slaves beneath the Golden City had revealed not just Carthaginian secrets, but the inevitable destination of any empire that discovered the terrible efficiency of organized suffering. The end.